Segundo día del LTE World Summit que se celebra aquí en la ciudad de Barcelona, donde se está hablando todo lo que es el tema LTE para los operadores y para el mercado a nivel mundial. Y contamos con la presencia de Tomás, que es un analista de Informa, que esperemos que nos ayude un poco a discernir qué ha estado pasando en estos 2 días. Estamos ya, no terminando, pero quedan 3 o 4 horitas para acabar el show. Así que más o menos ya tenemos una idea de las conclusiones principales que se pueden sacar del Congreso. Así que cambio el inglés para hablar con Tomás y que él nos cuente un poco, nos haga de periodista improvisado y nos cuente qué ha pasado. Thomas, welcome to Telesemana.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I was telling the audience that we are almost closing the show at this point. I mean, probably we've seen already the keynotes and the presentations, so you know, we have a sense of what happened here this week. Why don't you tell us, and you do as a journalist for us in this case, and tell us what you heard, what are the conclusions, and once you get to the office with your team and sit down and they ask you, hey, Thomas, you know, what happened there?
So
what would you say?
I think what we're seeing is that LTE has for sure enjoyed the most successful launch of any mobile technology in history.
Okay.
There are now more networks.
But we say that with every technology is being launched.
Yeah, right. So this is the point, right?
Okay.
So what we would say is that the reality of the market is perhaps a little bit clouded by some of the big success stories, some of the noise that's coming out of probably only 3 or 4 markets where there's actually any significant uptake.
Okay.
So where we look for success stories, it's the US, it's Japan, and it's Korea. And when we go outside that footprint, I think you're working much harder actually to find
LTE?
For LTE.
What about
right.
the northern countries in Europe?
I think that's really interesting, right? So the world's first LTE network was launched in Sweden, almost 2009 actually. So right at the end of 2009, nearly 3 years ago.
So they still have 3 base stations only?
Right, so there's a few points here. So one, people say there's lots of networks, but what constitutes a live network is very ambiguous. So Verizon, it covers tens, even hundreds of millions of people, but lots of the commercial networks have only been deployed in very limited footprint. So in a few small or a few big cities, but in a few hotspot locations. So that's one point. We heard a lot this week that there are hundreds of devices, dozens of manufacturers have created these devices. But the reality, if you go to the stores of the operators that have launched LTE, if you do an analysis of the portfolios, what you actually see is that only a fraction of those devices have made it into the retail channel. So normally most operators only have 1 to 2 devices on show, so that's limiting uptake.
Okay.
And the third thing is pricing, and this is what we at Informa have been talking about a lot. How do you bring LTE to market? What should the commercial strategy be to try to not only excite customers, to encourage them, but convince them to spend? And what we're seeing is that perhaps the operators have been a little bit naive, not necessarily learnt some of the lessons about how to do that successfully.
You're being very harsh with LTE and with the operators.
It's the analyst job, right?
Okay, that's good. That's good.
Right, we're not being harsh. No, our job is to come here. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of vendors trying to sell equipment.
I appreciate the honesty, because actually I was expecting perhaps more hype from you because you are Informa. This is your show, and actually you are not hyping it. You are doing actually the opposite work, which I think is very honest, and I like it.
So LTE is undoubtedly the future. It's important to come to events like this to learn about the technology, but not only to learn about the technical aspect, to learn about how to go to market, how to make a success. And I think it's precisely why people need to come here, because then we can share some of our experiences, and the operators can come and share their experiences about what has worked and what hasn't worked. And what hasn't worked is premium pricing.
Okay.
So in the Nordic markets you mentioned specifically, we've seen operators try to charge a real premium, in some cases 250% more than you would do to connect to 3G markets, and it's just failed. It's just not worked. Customers, from a fixed broadband perspective, have never been prepared to pay for speed. We think that customers value speed, but it's hard to make them to pay for it. So one of the things we've been talking about, is how do you convey to the customer the real benefits of LTE beyond speed? How does speed transform the experience? How do the services that I like to use perhaps on the fixed network suddenly become realistic and credible on a mobile device, whether that's a smartphone or a tablet? And I think one of the big mistakes that we've seen is that operators have tried to sell LTE on features. They talk about the technology, and consumers don't understand that.
They've done that since 3G.
Yeah.
So that's not new. So
as you were saying, 2 years ago I came to this event and I said, it's going to be important for the success of LTE to learn the mistakes from 3G. And I thought perhaps
That
people would
somebody
listen,
yeah.
but
No
you
way.
know, we see the mistakes being created again
Over
and
over.
again.
Yeah. And,
So-
and you know, not to bring you bad news, but you know, with 5G, probably things would
It's
repeat
quite
itself.
funny, right? So actually, some of the presentations have been talking not only about LTE, not only about LTE Advanced, but about LTE beyond.
Yeah.
So thinking, you know,
Already-
way beyond. And you know, sometimes we just have to take a view, come to reality, come to today's market, because you know we need to be selling the technology that we have. That, you know, to be honest, isn't even proven yet. Yes, there are 15 million customers, but 10 million of those LTE customers are on
Yes.
Verizon's network.
Okay, well, good point. Let me ask you about services then, because
Okay.
you said something which is very important. We keep talking about speeds, and you said users are used to some service around the fixed area, but those services, we already know, do not belong to the operators and probably would never will. Because we're seeing that over-the-top dominates fixed,
Yeah.
the fixed environment.
Yeah.
Now we're seeing that on mobile, over-the-top is starting to get more traction, and actually, even brands, I would say, some brands are getting even more exposure than the operators' brands. So if you talk to WhatsApp, everybody knows what it is.
Yep.
Probably worldwide.
Yeah.
But if you go to, I don't know, Korea and you say Movistar, nobody knows who Movistar is, or Telefonica.
it's
You know,
true.
a user, I mean,
Yeah.
not somebody in the industry. So what's going to happen with that? I mean, because how can you convince a user to go to LTE based on services if your services do not belong to you?
The thing that we would say is that there's a lot of negative talk around simply providing access to customers. But what you have to remember is that Facebook, WhatsApp, YouTube, none of these services work if the network's not in place.
True.
And that puts the operator in a very strong position.
But the network's not in place.
Well, they are, but
And they keep talking about
but
expanding
imagine if they're not,
capacity.
right? So
All right.
the fact that the operators have built the networks, they control the networks, that means that if they can build their pricing models correctly, you know, there's
They
a
can
very
compete.
optimistic future for them. They don't have to necessarily compete in the service layer. Some of them will, and in some markets, especially in emerging markets, yes, there's a credible role for operators to play in certain types of services. I think one of the things that's interesting is that there's a lot of focus on entertainment and entertainment style services, because you know it's the sexy services. This is what people talk about in the media, it's on the TV, it's what friends talk about. But actually, there's more money to be made from simple things that improve the efficiency, that save time, save cost for customers. We would call it something like smart living enablement. Help customers to you know, to live an easier lifestyle. And you know, it's not sexy necessarily, but what customers value more than anything is time and their money. And if you can bring solutions to the market that help them do that.
Hold on. Let's let the lady finish, because you know has happened in a couple of interviews. We need to talk to the organizers. Well, with you.
Yeah, sure.
See how we coordinate with her. All right. Thank you. All right. Go on.
So
Sorry, I cut you off.
we were talking about should operators try to bring entertainment style services to market, or are there opportunities beyond those kind of services which perhaps are less sexy, less interesting, but still have revenue opportunities? And we would say yes, absolutely. So we've seen, for example, AT&T just recently has been talking about their concept of the smart home.
Yeah.
And that's a place where the operator can play, because they can help customers to make their lifestyle just much, much easier. So that's an interesting area. But you know, for us, we've done a lot of work looking at pricing models, especially for data, trying to understand how operators can evolve pricing models to drive profitable and sustainable growth as this data business explodes. And we believe that pricing will be, if not the most important, certainly one of the most important factors in determining the future success of operators. And like I said before, without the networks, these services simply don't work.
Sure.
So if you price that access in the right way, you're onto a winner. And what we need to see is this transition away from simply bringing bigger and bigger bundles to market, 10 gigabytes, 20 gigabytes, towards pricing in a more intelligent
It goes
way.
against the operators, actually.
Yeah, it does. And what's interesting, you know, people talk about the commoditization of data. Actually, in a lot of cases, the operators are commoditizing this product themselves.
Yes.
By, you know, simply bringing a tariff to market that gives you 10 gigabytes, even though the mass market customer will rarely ever reach the limit. You know, and if you don't think about the limit that you have, you don't care about the cost, and if you don't care about the cost, you're not going to be prepared to pay a premium.
True. Okay. Finally, in my view, and I'm going to make this as short as possible, we're seeing some OTTs like Facebook, suddenly they go to the stock market, and now they have to build their own infrastructure. They have to build more data centers. They need to hire an operator in the northern countries to build a fiber optic network because they want to make sure their OTT service works perfectly, because now they have, you know, responsibility. So we're seeing that with our OTTs. Google is also doing some caching with some operators to make sure content is close to them. They are investing on the network. At the end of the day, are the OTTs something that will play in favor of the operators in the future? At least those that make money, because those that don't make money, you know, there's nothing you can do. I mean, if WhatsApp keeps on doing free messaging and it works more or less okay, a lot of people will use it. But once WhatsApp becomes so aware of its own success, probably they need to have some sort of, you know, network quality that they are willing to pay.
Yeah. So very interesting keynote session today. In fact, I chaired a panel this morning, and we were talking about exactly this, about partnerships between operators and OTT players.
Where money is involved.
Yeah, well, how can they establish relationships where value is exchanged on both sides? And on the panel we had Google, we had a guy from Telenor, and then we had Jar Jar and 20 is the Spanish Facebook.
Yes.
And you know, what was really interesting is
I wish
that
they were the Spanish Facebook. But okay, close enough.
We can debate that later perhaps, but they're doing interesting things, and they've carved out a niche, is what I'd say about 20, and they've got an MVNO, and all that's very interesting. But anyway, I think what we're seeing is a willingness on both sides to start to understand each other's businesses more. Because I think one of the problems has been is that just like operators don't understand what Google and Facebook are doing, Google and Facebook in the past didn't necessarily understand how they could get value from the operators. And now, you know, those conversations are starting to happen. That's what we heard on the panel. More conversations happening. What's also happening is an exchange of people between the companies. So Google and Facebook are recruiting telco executives. Telecoms operators are trying to recruit people with experience of working in, you know, in the digital world, and on the internet. And that's important because it means they can communicate more effectively, and you know, it's really simple things. But that transition as well as structural transition. So we heard last week that Etisalat, an operator in the Middle East, has just created a new digital division. Telefonica, of course, has Telefonica Digital, probably one of the leaders in doing that. And this is all about creating a new culture, a new mindset within the operators to think like an internet player, to think like a startup, and to then engage with other startups around. And you know, it's a really positive thing, I think, and gives us more optimism that perhaps operators can, something's changing, and that we can find a balance and a way forward. Because, as you said before, these companies need each other. They will need to work together for caching, for ensuring quality of service. And also for monetizing users effectively. I think, you know, successful partnerships have been built in the past, and we'll see more of that in the future for sure.
Okay, I'm gonna have to leave you here because it's you know, my time is running. But I would like to talk to you in the future about those digital divisions, and especially Telefonica, as you were saying, is one of the leading.
Yeah.
I have my doubts about the success of that division, but you know, I see you are enthusiastic about it, so probably we need to have a discussion.
I would say that we view with optimism the fact that they are trying to change.
Okay.
Whether they will change or not is another story, but yeah, we should come back and revisit that.
Well, the ladies are getting here, so probably it's a good signal that we need to leave again. Thank you so much for visiting us.
No.
And let's hear the message. Okay, the session is ending.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much for visiting us.
Thank you for having us.